out of reach. Secure and affordable housing is perhaps the most intimate form of infrastructure. Its degree of connectivity to the extended circulatory systems of power, water, transport and telecommunications are used the world over as shorthand for degrees of modernity and civilisation. So what are we to make, in this most abundantly wealthy of nations, of the knowledge that there are Aboriginal communities in the Western Desert in which no new houses can be built, even though there's funding available for it, to relieve chronic overcrowding because the obsolete electricity generators are too underpowered to handle any increase in the load? Should we query why inner urban communities share close proximity to public transport, fast telecommunications, health and education services, while outer metropolitan and regional communities struggle to maintain even basic standards of service provision? Infrastructure in Australia, as anywhere else, is deeply political. Tens of billions of dollars in construction and maintenance contracts, monopoly rents from power plants and other utilities, freight rail lines that swing right by your coal mine, or light rail lines that run past your shopping centre, and slowly but surely expanding citywide traffic jams that are gradually paralysing whole communities. Exploiting this unsustainable traffic congestion with private toll roads and closing alternative routes, as has happened here in Australia. Infrastructure is political. The politics of infrastructure is the difference between a train that arrives every 4 minutes and a bus that arrives every 4 hours. It's the difference between ready proximity to services, schools and hospitals, or being stranded over the horizon, far from friends, family and a job. And it's the difference between infrastructure provision for the widest public benefit versus narrow private interests. So what are we to make of the bill that the government lands on us today? The bill proposes reforms to Infrastructure Australia to give effect to the Prime Minister's pre-election commitment to abolish Commonwealth funding to every public transport project in the country. There will be no public transport under a government I lead, effectively, the Prime Minister declared, one of the few pre-election commitments that he's actually decided to keep. It has killed the Brisbane Cross River Rail project. It has stalled the pre-feasibility work that was going on into the Melbourne Metro. We can kiss goodbye any expansions to Sydney's commuter rail network. It ripped $500 million out of the Perth Light Rail project, and it gave the Barnett government the excuse that it needed to delay the project by 5 years or more. The East Coast high-speed rail studies, that presumably now gets shelved to collect dust with all the other high-speed rail studies. And that's talented planning and project teams walking out the door right around the country at the stroke of a pen, killing projects that our suburbs and regional communities desperately need. I think it's fair to say that this Prime Minister has something of a freeway fetish. In April 2013, from opposition, he took a doorstop in Frankston and said this: "The Commonwealth Government," he said, "has a long history of funding roads. We have no history of funding urban rail, and I think it's important that we stick to our knitting. And the Commonwealth's knitting when it comes to funding infrastructure is roads." Knitting! How quaint. Commonwealth infrastructure policy described using interpretive handcraft metaphors. It gets better. This is from January 2013, again from opposition. "Better roads mean better communities," the then opposition leader said. "They're good for our physical and mental health. They're even good for our environment, because cars that are moving spew out far less pollution than those that are standing still." So there you have it. National mental health policy just needed a good solid concrete pour for a new urban freeway. To give legislative effect to this embarrassing and counterproductive delusion, the government had proposed to gut the independence of the Commonwealth's only and certainly most authoritative infrastructure advisory body, which is Infrastructure Australia. The original proposal was to allow ministers to be able to compel Infrastructure Australia to assess particular pet projects. The government also wanted to be able to preclude IA from assessing whole categories of projects, to prevent them from spreading their seditious opinions on the public benefits of cycling infrastructure or public transport. We could refer to it as the Stick to Your Knitting Amendment. And keep in mind, Infrastructure Australia's processes are not determinative. This is an advisory body that we're talking about. All it does is evaluates the projects that the states and territories put forward to it and assembles them into a national priority list, which it believes offer the best value for the Commonwealth's scarce capital. IA's processes are not perfect, and when we get to the committee stage a bit later, I'll go into more detail about my strong concerns about how cost-benefit analysis factors are used and abused to artificially inflate the value of some projects and kill others. The main thing to keep in mind is IA processes are an attempt to assess infrastructure funding without politicians in the room demanding that marginal seats should all get concrete poured on them. The final decision about which projects actually get funded rests with the executive. Exhibit A of this quite important fact that IA is no more or less than an expert advisory body is the fact that the Commonwealth's post-election infrastructure commitments and determinations, none of them coming from IA's priority list. The spending is favoured 3-1 in, guess what, Abbott government seats, Liberal and National seats. What a remarkable coincidence. 75% or more. How about that? That's why you need independence. That's why you need an expert in the room to keep the politicians and the politics at arm's length. And it's not what we're getting, but it also, I guess, underlines the fact that the government, no matter what this chamber does with this bill, no matter how much surgery we are expected to perform to improve it and send it back to the House of Reps, the Abbott executive is still entirely free to ignore everything we say and cherry-pick their own projects. Something obviously has to give. So, as you can imagine, my first instinct was to advise my Greens colleagues to vote against this atrocity, and we figured it might be worth, however, drafting amendments to see whether it could be fixed or even, heaven forbid, improved. Now, the opposition amendments that Senator Conroy foreshadowed do go some of the way. Our amendments go some of the way. I'll talk a bit more about that in a moment and at greater length when we get to the committee stage. But the icing on this particular bit of black humour from the Abbott government was the government's own amendments, because they basically invert or gut the purpose of the bill. It's remarkable. And so we will see how this plays out when we get to the committee stage, but it may be that the Greens support the bill when the amendments have finally worked their way through, on the basis of the fact that the Abbott government itself appears to be in the process of circulating amendments in here that would fix some of the dopiest features of the bill. So that's interesting. Deputy Prime Minister Warren Truss, when he announced this extraordinary step the other day, and let's pay credit, if he's listening to the evidence, then that's what we hope governments will do. He said on Wednesday that the government wanted to clear up ambiguities about planned changes to Infrastructure Australia, which had led to a misunderstanding that its intention was to make the body less independent. No, I think we understand perfectly well what the government's attempting to do. And once we've had a chance to take a look at Minister Truss's amendments, it may be that that misunderstanding is in fact cleared up and the bill can proceed. We will see. The Greens, I'll foreshadow now, will be moving amendments to put the topic of climate change back on Infrastructure Australia's desk. Can you imagine the mentality of the person sitting behind the scenes somewhere who wanted to strike all mention of climate change from Infrastructure Australia, from an advisory body? It doesn't even force the Abbott government to appear to care about climate change, but it at least says the expert advisory body should pay attention to the impacts on infrastructure, that it's getting chewed away on our coastlines right around the country. It's exposed to increased incidents of bushfires. It's going to kill people in heat waves. Shortly before, the government bowled over and took out the major cities unit, fired everybody. That was providing expert advice on the future of Australian cities. Reasonably important entity, you would have thought, and kudos to the former Rudd government for setting it up in the first place. In one of the most heavily urbanised countries in the world, you'd think maybe we'd need some Commonwealth expertise on city policy. Their last State of the Cities report said heat deaths in Australian cities will double by 2050, apart from in Queensland and Perth, where they will quadruple by 2050. It's real, whether you think it's absolute crap or not. So the Greens will be moving to bring climate change back within the remit of Infrastructure Australia. And that must be remarkably galling, hoping to see the government accept those amendments go back in when we know a substantial fraction of your executive doesn't believe that this is happening at all. How nice that must be for you. So the first draft of this bill should clearly never have seen the light of day. I very much look forward to turning it into something readable and into something that may go some way towards improving service delivery and infrastructure provision to a country and to communities that really desperately need it. I thank the Chamber.